man who's described as the best defense and intelligence reporter in the country. His name is Bill Gertz. I first met him, I think it was 2011, and we met at the old D.C. post office. That's now the Trump International Hotel. And it was kind of a hidden meeting. Some friends set it up because there was a lot of chatter about a report that I'd written for the Pentagon, and I didn't trust all the reporters that were sniffing around the story and calling me. In fact, the London Times had written a front page story, and I didn't participate in that story because I didn't know if I could trust the London Times reporter. But there's one man I did trust, and that's Bill Gertz, and he's our guest in this episode of the Economic War Room. Now, when he wrote the story, Drudge Report follows him, so it hit Drudge Report, and things went nuts. In fact, shortly after, Megyn Kelly contacted me, Maria Bartiromo, Glenn Beck, and a few others contacted me and said, we want to interview you on the show. That's the impact of this reporter. He's more than a reporter. He really is an analyst, and in so many ways, he is an expert on national security and defense matters. If you want to know who you can trust, read Bill Gertz. So, he's got a new book out, and Bill, welcome to the Economic War Room.
Hi, Kevin. Great to be on the program.
You know, you've been right on every issue. You're for America, you're for the truth, you're for justice, but you know the insides of the Pentagon. What was that comment? I think it was the former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said that you got information in the Pentagon faster than he did, or something along those lines.
He said I was drilling holes in the Pentagon and sucking out the information. I'm not sure whether he meant it as a compliment, but I sure took it that way.
Well, I'm glad that you're doing that because you bring the truth to the American people, and I really appreciate it. And you do it as a patriot. You've never been trying to tear down this great country, tear down our military. You're a friend of the military and a friend of the intelligence agencies.
Yes. You know, this book, Deceiving the Sky, is really the culmination of 20 years of in-depth investigative reporting on China. And I wrote the China threat back in 2000, and it was, again, warning about all the things that are happening now, and they've kind of come true, and I've kind of captured that in this new book.
No, I love the book. In the introduction, you open with a story about being in the Pentagon, in the office of the Defense Intelligence Agency, talking to a three-star general. Now, that's something I've done a few times, it's very familiar. But you were talking about the year 1999, I guess, and you said the general told you flat out, China is not a threat.
It wasn't just the general, it was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And what he was saying was that China was not a threat, and of course my response was, why do you think that? And his answer, to paraphrase it, was because the Chinese told us that. And I was totally shocked. But it became very clear to me within a very few years that why he was saying that. A major spy was uncovered inside the Defense Intelligence Agency. His name was Ron Monteperto. He was a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, and he was eventually convicted of passing classified information to two Chinese military intelligence attachés at the embassy in Washington. So what he was saying was a reflection of these intelligence analysis that had totally jumped into bed with the Chinese. And it was really the heart of the issue that our intelligence community, our policy community, our academic community has all been kind of infiltrated with these pro-China analysts, and or worse, in the case of Monteperto, he was actually a Chinese spy.
Well, he was convicted of Chinese spying, but I dealt with someone who kind of looked to him as a mentor. When I was talking in the DIA, I dealt with Lonnie Henley, and Lonnie Henley, I think, even stood up for Monteperto at a hearing, saying, "Hey, he's really not a bad guy. We should go easy on him."
Yeah, and again, this is a reflection of a 30-plus years of intelligence failures on China. They got China wrong, and it was all based on a false premise. The premise was, if we trade with China, if we engage China, then this will have a moderating influence on the communist dictatorship in Beijing. It will create a non-threatening, benign China. The engagement strategy was an utter failure. Let me give you just one example. back during the Clinton administration in the 90s, the United States decided that it was going to engage China in, quote, nuclear cooperation and space cooperation. So we sent some of our nuclear laboratory scientists from Los Alamos and other places to China. And guess what happened? Within a few short years, and this was a conclusion of the CIA in the late 90s, China obtained through espionage secrets on every single deployed warhead in the U.S. arsenal.
Wow.
When it comes to space cooperation, we transferred missile technology to their space launchers, which helped prevent their missiles from blowing up on the launch pad. We also gave them a multiple satellite launcher, which was converted into multiple warhead technology, which is now targeted at U.S. cities. So the engagement strategy was an utter
Complete
disaster.
failure. Absolutely. And they've been stealing intellectual property for years. You mentioned the figure that I've heard, $600 billion a year potentially, that they drain from our economy and put into their economy.
Yeah, this was the result of a White House study. It was, I think the figure was 250 billion annually to 600 billion in theft of intellectual property and technology.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. I guess the DIA and the CIA never really bothered to read the book Unrestricted Warfare published by those two senior colonels.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in the book, In Deceiving the Sky, discussing the Unrestricted Warfare book, because it is a blueprint for what is happening now with Communist China. Across the board, the Chinese are waging all types of warfare. This is what they refer to as unrestricted warfare. And again, it's beyond military. It includes economic. It includes intelligence warfare. Now you can add cyber warfare to that. You can add space warfare to that. And so it's an across-the-board assault on the United States. I describe it as a new Cold War, that we're really back into the era of a Cold War. The problem is only one nation has been waging it, and that's China. The United States is beginning to change course, but it's still relatively stuck in the non-Cold War, let's just trade with China approach to this problem.
Well, you picked an interesting title, Deceiving the Sky. Can you explain how that ties into what China's been doing?
Yes, Deceiving the Sky is, everyone is familiar with Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese strategist. But there are other strategies as well. One of them is called the 36 Strategies. It was written probably 200 BC in something that's called the Warring States era in China. And this is a period where China was divided into probably 6 or 7 warring provinces. And the 36 Strategies is basically how does a weaker power defeat a stronger power? And the Chinese have adapted that. So Deceiving the Sky is the first of the 36 strategies. And the actual statement is deceive the sky to cross the ocean. And the story goes that a Chinese emperor was reluctant to go to war with one of the neighboring provinces. And so one of his generals told him that he would come to dinner at the house of a peasant. So when the emperor stepped into the house of the peasant, it moved. And he realized he wasn't in this peasant's house, he was in a boat. And the boat was sailing to the province that they were going to war with. So the emperor had to decide, well, do I go back or we go to war? And he decided to go to war. The point is that you can deceive even the emperor, which in Chinese mythology is almost like God. And so you can even deceive God in order to go to war against your enemy. And that's what they're doing against the United States.
Well, and deception's been a long part of their strategy against us and against other nations. I think the Belt and Road, in a sense, is a bait and switch. Oh, yeah, we'll invest all of this into your economy, and yet the nation that participates may find that they lose the port that was financed, they lose the airport, or they find a lot of technology that's in place to spy on their people.
Yeah, this is the key feature of Chinese communist expansionism in the 21st century. It really kind of launched under Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012-2013 time period. Up until that time, the Chinese strategy toward the world was outlined by Deng Xiaoping, who was the post-Mao reformer, who got the ball rolling on their big modernization. And under Deng, the strategy was bide our time, build our capabilities. Xi Jinping has come online now and said, we're not biding our time and we're no longer building, we're going to continue building, but we've reached the point where now we can take action. And he set forth something called the China Dream, which is really a communist nightmare of how China will emerge as the world's leading superpower. The Belt and Road Initiative is this infrastructure project in the developing world. They hope to really end run the United States by encircling the United States through the developing world with Chinese hegemony. In other words, they want to dominate the periphery of the United States, and ultimately they want to dominate the United States.
Well, and that's the purpose, is they want to be the most powerful nation. They think it's their rightful place, and they think historically that's where they have been. It may not always be true, but that is the Chinese belief, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I also, in Deceiving the Sky, I spend a lot of time focusing on Chinese communist ideology. And the reason for that is I did a debate in New York City probably 10 or 15 years ago on China, the threat from China. And one of the debaters on the pro-China side came up to me after it. He said, I've been doing business in China for 20 years and I've never met a communist. And I was totally shocked. I told him, I said, really, all you need to do is, when next time you're in Beijing, go to the People's Liberation Army Museum. Inside of that museum today, they have statues of Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Marx, Engels, all the great communist leaders. So this deception of China is that it's no longer communist has had wide-reaching impact in the United States and around the world.
Well, and that one of the things that you point out in chapter 1, you say how communists lie. And so it really is that they have to pretend that they're not communists in order to take position, right?
Yeah, but the good news is the Trump administration has made a major fundamental shift in U.S. policy towards China, and that's really the most positive development in my 35 years of covering this issue. Is really looking at how we're no longer doing this unfettered engagement. So I'm fairly optimistic that the way things are going, that President Trump has focused on economic issues, but the impact has reverberated throughout the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, and the military and Pentagon as well. So it's very positive. I hope that the president stays the course and will continue with this tough policy, because no nation can survive when it loses up to $600 billion a year in its most important precious commodities, which are our intellectual properties. Our country, our economy is based on intellectual property and technology and innovation, and if we don't do enough to stop this, the country will not survive.
Well, I think you're right. I think there is good news. I mean, you and I worked with people in the Pentagon. You even mentioned in your book 10 years ago, and nobody was having any idea that there was economic warfare with China. Why would China do anything to harm us? But what they don't know is something you put in your book, which I thought was very interesting. President Xi most admires, you listed 3 people, and the middle one, number 2, was the one that struck me. Can you share about who President Xi most admires?
Yeah, he's an admirer of Mao Zedong, the communist founder, who's widely regarded as the world's most notorious mass murderer. He's been blamed for upwards of 60 million deaths of Chinese. He's also an admirer of Adolf Hitler, because he believes that Hitler almost took over the entire world. And he's also an admirer of Joseph Stalin, because Stalin was able to take over the Russian military, obviously with disastrous consequences when it came to World War II.
Yeah, well, you can learn a lot about someone based on whom they admire. And in this case, he admires thugs and dictators and people that want to dominate the world. And that's a little frightening.
Yeah, and there's another aspect of that, is that who the persons that Xi Jinping dislikes or hates the most. And that includes Deng Xiaoping, the reform communist, and Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was responsible for helping to bring down the Soviet Union. So those are the 2 people that the current Chinese leader, supreme leader, dislikes the most.
Yeah, but here's the problem. And while it's obvious to me, it should be obvious to everybody, it's not obvious in government, it's not obvious in academia, it's not obvious in social circles, and it's not obvious in business circles. Most of those still believe China can be our friend if we'll just work with them. How is it that they've pulled this off?
Well, it's been I'll tell you what it has been. The Chinese watched as the Soviet Union collapsed. During the latter days of the Cold War, the Reagan administration launched a program to block technology from the Soviet Union. And it was a key feature in the Soviet Union collapsing in December of 1991. The Chinese have studied that, so they took a different approach. They've tried to befriend the United States. They've deceived our intelligence people. They've deceived our policymakers. They've deceived presidents through successive administrations. And what that has done is that's allowed them to steal the technology that actually made their, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics appear successful. Well, President Trump is saying now, let's see if your economy can survive without the theft of American technology. So what we're seeing now with the tariff debate and the trade war, I think is a real bellwether to find out whether this Chinese communism will succeed. And for all intents and purposes, it's not. The Chinese economy is on the downward spiral. And we see unrest in Hong Kong, which has been the pocketbook for China for many years. We see unrest in other parts of China, Western Xinjiang, where they were forced to imprison up to between 1 and 2 million Muslim Uyghurs. We see further unrest in Tibet, which again was taken over by the Chinese in 1950. So the signs for China are not good, and we'll see what happens in the coming years.
Well, we need to open our eyes. I mean, for example, I just read in Reuters that the Australian Intelligence Service concluded that China was behind a hack on the parliament and political parties, but they hid the truth because they didn't want to interfere with trade. And that's how I think China is planning on. And what I'm very concerned about is China knows that President Trump is their problem. And so what measures might they take prior to an election to unseat President Trump? And that concerns me. Have you thought about that?
Absolutely. In fact, I thought about your landmark study about what happened in the early 2000s economic downturn, where your idea that an outside power could affect and create a massive recession in the United States. China certainly could do that. We see the Democrats already are playing with that narrative, that almost wishing for an American economic recession as a way to unseat President Trump in the 2020 election. And I'm very concerned. I think that Congress should set up a special commission to look at whether China could take economic action that would cause our economy to tank. Again, they also need to look at Chinese election meddling. Last October, and I have this in Deceiving the Sky, Vice President Pence gave an important speech at the Hudson Institute where he talked about how China is working to meddle inside the U.S. election system. And he basically said China wants a different president, and they're working to do that. He talked about how they're influencing the farm states, which may have been affected by some of the tariffs, in order to turn public sentiment against the president. So this is a very serious issue, and I hope that Congress and the administration take steps to counter it.
Well, from my perspective, if they don't, 2025 looks really ugly for us, with 5G domination by China, cyber dominance, the Assassins Mason space war that you talk about. I mean, we could be in a very bad situation if they're successful and they end our focus on China. But the good news, like you've talked about, is it's not too late. President Trump has taken the right approach. In my lifetime, he's the first president to really confront China that I'm aware of. And I think you make a good point. You say the Chinese people, you dedicated your book to the Chinese people because they're good people.
And they want to get rid of this horrible communist regime, the legacy of which involves the death of tens of millions of Chinese citizens. It's very, very important that we keep the same course that we're going on. Now, the other point of good news is that despite our hyper-partisan atmosphere here in Washington, there is an emerging consensus. Even Democrats are beginning to recognize that the threat from China is serious. I remember early on, former Vice President Biden came out and poo-pooed the idea that the United States should compete with China or view China as a strategic competitor, saying something like, how can we can't compete with China. And then within a few days, he backed off from that and started saying harsher things about Beijing. And clearly, he recognizes that the issue of the China threat, which I view as an existential threat to the United States, is going to be a central issue in the upcoming 2020 presidential election.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There's no question about that. And one of the things I really like about your book is that you give us good news and then you give us some solution sets. You tell us there are 14 things that you say that we ought to be doing in one of the latter chapters of your book. And with your permission, Bill, we'd like to just hit a quick summary of those when we print our battle plan. We're going to recommend everybody get a copy of this book. It's a phenomenal book. You've done a great job not only giving us the history so that we understand where China's coming from and what we've been doing and why we were asleep, but you give us the way to wake up and what we can do about it. Can you just share, in closing, just a couple of solutions, things we ought to do to address this serious China threat?
Sure. Yeah, the first, in the conclusion of Deceiving the Sky, I talk about basically liberate the Chinese people and declare China an enemy. The United States made this major shift under President Trump by identifying China as a strategic competitor. They stopped short of calling it an adversary or an enemy, which they need to do. And the reason is because the United States, for the last 40 years, has been told, oh, let's integrate our economy with China. We're totally integrated, so we can't just immediately disengage, but we need to begin the disengagement from the Chinese economy. And I think we're starting to see a lot of companies doing that, companies that thought this great market of 1.4 billion people was the greatest benefit for their business, and now they're having second thoughts. So they need to look for new markets. Obviously, I think India would be a great place to look. It's the world's largest democracy. Let's do business there. One of the things I call for is creating a Asian alliance of democracy, like NATO. Get the democratic nations of Asia, which are concerned about the threat from China, the growing hegemonic threat to their existence, and create an alliance in Asia. I think this is very important. Another recommendation is to create a parliament in exile. Create a democratic system outside of China and have them meet once a year. Make policy recommendations for a free and open China, free media, elections, democratic institutions, free rule of law, and then publish these and send them into China. I think it's very possible that the Communist Party of China, which is really the source of the problem, it's not the Chinese people, it's the Communist Party, which has upwards of 90 million people. That's really the key to mitigating what I call the China threat.
Absolutely, no question. Well, Bill, I certainly appreciate you taking time with us today, and we need to get this information out. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Kevin.
We all need to get a copy of Bill Gertz's book, Deceiving the Sky, and we need to read it, and we need to share it. You even might go on further and write a review on Amazon, because this is absolutely important information that everybody's got to understand. China is not our friend. China is a threat, but the Chinese people are tremendous people. And Bill's got a perfect balance in the book to really help understand that and then have practical suggestions of what we should do about it. And you also need to download your free battle plan for this week's episode at economicwarroom.com. We will list the 14 steps that Bill Gertz says we need to do as a nation to protect ourselves in this ongoing economic war. Now, we always like to close with something beautiful. And I'll tell you, something beautiful to me is to see the Hong Kong residents waving American flags. These people love liberty. They understand what freedom means. They've lived in one of the fastest growing economies in the world for decades because it was the freest economy. The greater the liberty, the greater the prosperity, and they've enjoyed it. But Hong Kong is being sucked away by China. There are threats from the PLA coming into town. They're taking away right after right. But the Hong Kong people, they're enduring. And it really warmed my heart to see them gather together and worship God. In fact, the anthem of the Hong Kong freedom movement is Sing Hallelujah to the Lord. That's a beautiful segment. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.